Podcast. Dark Horse presents Aliens. Deactivating language censorship. Warning. Spoilers activated.
It is called a Berserker team, reckless, desperate volunteers recruited by the company to destroy alien infestations. Based on the spaceship Nemesis, it consists of 3 brutal ex-cons who do all the grunt work and the Berserker itself, codenamed Max, an armed and armored exoskeleton powered by the living brain of what was once a human, configured into an unstoppable killing machine. When the Nemesis is sent to a massive space station, DS-949, the team finds an alien hive, the largest in history, with nearly 1,000 hapless humans cocooned and incubated. The team mission: to destroy the aliens while leaving the terminal intact. The mission seems like suicide to the bug hunters and their small support staff. And that is perfectly fine for the company, which wants no witnesses left to the terrifying secret of DS-949.
I'm picking up Dark Horse Insider number 32 again, this being the one with the Division 13 cover by Arthur Adams, and it's got a real heft to it. It's 48 pages on a very bright white stock. The cover date is August 1994, so we're definitely in the bust period, but you're not seeing that reflected in Insider. Inside, you got an interview with Harvey Pekar, you got another chapter of Tales of the Mask, and they're soliciting the final issues of the Will to Power Maxi series. And what this was another one of the Comics Greatest World crossovers. Comics Greatest World was, of course, Dark Horse's attempt to break into the superhero market with a series of dollar books where each book would introduce a new character, and every 4 books would introduce a new setting, a city. So they would have 4 cities that would be interplaying with one another over the course of their stories. Eventually they launched a number of ongoing series out of that event, and this is them coming back to the format, $1 weekly books with nice quality covers. If I remember correctly, they still have the cardstock glossy covers. You got Jerry Ordway, you got Mike Mignola. At least in this last few issues, you've got art by Chris Warner and Tim Bradstreet. That's nothing to sneeze at. The issue prior had Terry Dodson. And see, I'd bought all of those dollar books the first time around. The world didn't really grab me though, so I didn't carry on with it. And by this point, I think I was already in comics retail, so I would see these issues, but there were tons of copies of the original Comics Greatest World books out there. You don't really see, even in the cheap events, I don't really see Will to Power very often. I just don't think that the sales were there. Obviously, people weren't as hot to follow universes that weren't as hot to buy comics blind, but also I think that this had been tried and essentially failed already. So the effort that was put into those books, I don't think paid off very well. It's also interesting to me to see what I believe was the last or the penultimate issue of one of the spin-off series, Catalyst's Agents of Change. Jason Pearson cover, by the way, the late Jason Pearson. The DC Comics character Magog, who of course spun out of Kingdom Come, always it's referenced that he is the Cable analog of the DC universe, or criticism of that type of character. And here I'm looking at Warmaker, a member of the Agents of Change, and you've got to acknowledge that this guy had an influence on the creation of Magog, just putting that out there. And of course, Dark Horse hasn't given up on the idea yet because Division 13 is launching just this month. They even give Keith Giffen an interview to help him sell the series. X has already been going for a while, and they're even offering a reprint of his serialized adventures in a Dark Horse Comics anthology. By the way, this was the last month that book was published. You've got the Mask movie adaptation, Barbed Wire still on the stands. So you go to the next issue, 33, that has a Mitch O'Connell cover. He was, by the way, selling some pretty nifty prints at Texas Frightmare this year. Inside front cover appears to be Time Cop. They're reprinting John Byrne's 2112 graphic novel. You've got the first collection of Hellboy, Seed of Destruction. There's a Madman door poster. The only real Aliens content in this issue is the solicitation for Visions, the art of Arthur Sidum. Commentary by Franz Hinkle, illustrated by Arthur Sidum, painted cover by Same. It's specifically the Genocide #1 cover. $29.95, shipping October 25th, 1994. There are a few fantasy comic artists who are able to successfully span the entire spectrum of technique and subject matter that the medium provides, but one of those select few is Arthur Sidum. Since he burst on the scene in the 1970s, Sidum has quietly been building a body of work that is second to none. From his dynamic comic covers for projects like Aliens or Batman vs. Predator, to whimsical treatments of children's books such as The Wind in the Willows, he has developed a distinct and evocative style that truly merits collection into this oversized art book. Filled with hundreds of illustrations in both color and black and white, beautifully designed and arranged, Visions, the art of Arthur Sidum, provides a career retrospective for current fans and an eye-popping introduction for newcomers. This big 12 by 12 inch volume is 128 pages of excellence and excitement. They've also got the trade collection for Predator vs. Magnus Robot Fighter. They're pushing some Shadow one-shots and trades. This is, I believe, around the time the Shadow movie was coming out. I apologize. This issue features the last solicitation for Dark Horse Comics, number 25, and it's actually promoting an Aliens vs. Predator story. More on that in future episodes. Dark Horse Insider 35 5, still hefty. Lots of Sin City material in this one. New stuff, collections, plenty of Grendel projects. You got Hellboy, of course. Jim Silkey's Rascals in Paradise. Panda Brothers Triple X. Promoting the new miniseries Indiana Jones and the Iron Phoenix by Lee Mars and Leo Doronia. Dave Dorman covers. There's a brief serialized Dirty Pair story by Adam Warren. Tom Veach and Cam Kennedy interviewed over Star Wars Dark Empire. No shortage of Star Wars material. The Early Adventures, Return of the Jedi, reprints of the Marvel material. Dark Lords of the Sith by Tom Veach. Chris Gossett, launching the new Machine series by John Arcudi and Ted Nafa. There's a $29.95 The Mask, The Origin Dark Horse Digital Edition, which seems to reprint one of the miniseries on that radical new compact disc format. You got a Mask limited edition cold cast figurine. The manga's starting to come in. We're seeing the early issues of Kasuke Fujishima's Oh My Goddess. Moving forward, several issues of Dark Horse Insider features material related to Spike Lee's Colors in Black and his Spike Comics imprint, short-lived unfortunately, that was emphasizing African-American experiences. Dark Horse continuing to put out editions of Mike Barron and Steve Rude's Nexus. We're still at a place where Aliens, Predator, the Deadliest of the Species is coming out. They're serializing the prose novella Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan the Lost Adventure, revised and completed by Joe R. Lansdale with illustrations by Charles Vess and covers by Arthur Sidem. They've got James Bond miniseries coming out. They actually tried to team up Nexus and Vortex after the Vortex maxi series had wrapped up. They announced the hiatus of Barbed Wire's publication with issue number 9, as we prepare to reintroduce this title with an all-new look and an all-new art team. I don't recall that ever actually came about. They begin their reprint series of Ghost in the Shell, Masamune Shiro's masterpiece from what I understand. I actually was buying that book as it was coming out, but I lost interest a few issues in. It was an 8-issue miniseries. I didn't make it to the end. You got 3x3 Eyes, Domu, A Child's Dream, Rebel Sword. Dark Horse is continuing to work with Universal Studios, putting out cold cast kits for figures like the Invisible Man from the original movie. You got the very nice The Bride of Frankenstein cold cast kit featuring box art painted by Den Beauvais. That was $150 in 1995 money. John Burns continuing his Babe micro mini series. One of them actually features a guest appearance by Abe Sapien. Completely forgot that happened. Trade paperback to John Burns Danger Unlimited. Launch of Harlan Ellison's Dream Corridor, a relatively short-lived anthology adapting the works of Harlan Ellison, including some new material. Solicitation copy for Aliens Berserker number 1 reads, there's a ship cutting through space like a bullet. Its crew a 5-man surgical strike team with a single mission. Destroy aliens. When the crew members of the Nemesis land smack in the middle of a full-blown hive, they're not sure if it's the answer to their prayers or the beginning of a nightmare. $2.50 US, $3.50 Canada, 32 color pages, painted cover, ships January 24th, 1995. Stop me if this sounds familiar. You've got a small crew of a ship. They're designated hunter killers. This group goes into a base that's infested with aliens, accompanied by a giant mech, and wipe out the hive. There's a black guy whose personality is basically, he's a black guy, and he appears throughout the story, but he doesn't really get a lot done, and he just is like default soldier guy. You got another dude whose whole job is to wear a special suit, get captured by alien drones, and taken into the nest so that they can triangulate where exactly the heart of the hive is so that the crew can come in to both rescue him and know their way to the queen. Then there's another guy, he's like the hard ass, like super soldier, crazy, violent, not somebody you necessarily want to hang out with in person, but definitely the guy you want at your back if you're going into an alien hive and trying to kill every motherfucking thing in your way. You got a boss who's directing all this stuff. He seems to be loyal to his men, but there's also company business on the back burner that we don't know the full details of. There's a mousy guy, nerd, wears glasses. He's responsible for the upkeep of the mech, but he's green. He doesn't really know what he's doing. It gets on people's nerves because he's not taking initiative. There's a lady. She has a bit of a relationship with the main boss guy. She is the communications expert, and she is the only person who's really empathetic to the nerdy guy and trying to get along with everybody in the group. They arrive at the base that's infested. This is an unexceptional job, and you get to see how it works by the numbers. The bait guy, Timpy, he goes in first. He gets captured. He gets taken to the hive. Once we know where he is, the Berserker unit is sent in. This is a supposed volunteer, although who would volunteer for this detail? They've got all kinds of tubes plugged into them. They're non-verbal. They're really not conscious most of the time. There's drugs being pumped into them to keep them sedated until it's time to rev them up. They're pumped full of adrenaline. They go into the base. They're just blowing away everything in sight. They're killing everybody but the bait. It's programmed so that it can't shoot anywhere within 2 feet of where the bait is. Tempe has a special helmet to prevent him from getting a face hugger onto it. He's successfully extracted. Job well done. Everybody gathers up to leave. Now we know what these guys are capable of, except some shadowy corporate guy calls in and says, I know you guys are about to take a break, but you have to go to this other base. You have to do this job. You can't tell anybody about it. You've got no backup. There's nobody coming in to help you. And by the way, it's also a huge base, and all of this is very, very hush-hush. The main guy, Pop, he's like, hey, this isn't cool. We're not ready for this sort of thing. We need help. And then he's told some kind of secret information. He's like, fuck. And then they're going to go in and do the assignment. If you said that all sounds like a comic book adaptation of the prose novella Tribes, goddamn right it is. It's not an official adaptation. Names have been changed. It is the same unit though. It's explicitly a Berserker just like it was in Tribes, but they've tweaked some things. And what's really, really weird about this is that Tribes itself was a novella. This is like the comic book version. And then the comic book version is adapted into an actual novel. This would be Aliens Berserker, written by S.T. Perry, the same person who's been writing most of these Aliens books for Bantam. But there's unusual qualities of this one. Number one, this is the last of the Bantam adaptations of Dark Horse comic book miniseries. This is actually the last Aliens novel in general until 2005, becoming on the tail end of the hysteria that was 1993 for Aliens and Alien 3. This is the only one of the Bantam novels that was not released outside the United States. When Dark Horse Press or DH Press takes over the novelizations in 2005, they were exclusively distributed in the United States, but the Bantam material was international, particularly in the UK. With Berserker, not only did it not get sent to the UK, but it was very small quantities in the United States. It looked like this was the wind down of the novelizations. Maybe they had too many returns, so they've got the book written, they put it out there in limited quantities. This is now among the most valuable of the Aliens prose novels because it's in such short supply. At the top of the show, we had a reading of the cover copy for the book. An amateur who goes on YouTube under the name Teach has done his own reading of the novel. It's 30 chapters plus a prologue and an epilogue. Take you a few hours to listen to if you'd like. To help get you in the mood, let me go ahead and give you a few minutes sample.
Chapter 1. They'd already been out of dock for a few weeks when they got the call. A mining outpost, 3 days away. 31 technicians trapped in the infested area, completely out of contact for over 80 hours. Deep 4 was populated by a few hundred machine techs and some low-level management, a company outpost like 100 others. This one melted dirt to get to Silurium, whatever the hell that was. Martin Jess didn't particularly give a shit, truth be known. He and his boys weren't called in to give a rat's ass about minerals, or miners for that matter. What mattered was that they were now 20 minutes out, probably no more than an hour till party time, which meant it was time to suit up. Jess took a final swig of coffee and tossed the cup into the recycler on his way out of the mess, gritting his teeth slightly as he walked beneath the cheaply framed doorway. Although he couldn't hear it, he knew that a soft mechanical beep went off in ops as he passed beneath the frame, recording codes from his surgical implant. He sighed inwardly as he headed down the dim and sweaty B corridor toward lockers. It still bothered him, even after all this time, one of the many annoying consequences of a felony conviction. Even the Corps wouldn't take chances on their leased volunteer ships. If any of their little birdies wanted to fly away, or, say, slit the captain's throat during a psychotic episode, these ships were set up to know all the gory details. Expensive in terms of equipment, but not as bad as trying to hire civilians for this sort of work. The open comm interrupted his wanderings. Jess, this is Pop. Tell the boys we're looking at 15 minutes till break. I wouldn't want Pulaski to choke to death on his sugar rush or anything. Jess spoke as he walked, grinning. It's gonna take more than a candy bar to kill the man. Jess didn't bother answering as he hung a left towards the unloading ramp, down a much shorter hallway, but as poorly lit and ventilated as the last. Even with the max aboard, HK teams didn't warrant the best of ships, though the Nemesis wasn't the worst he'd experienced. Not a luxury liner, but one of his first stints had been on a real shithole, a poured plastic job, the Exeter. This was before some genius got the idea to capitalize on team spirit by naming the newer breed of HK cruisers shit like Enmity and Wrath. Hell, compared to the Exeter, the Nemesis was a wet dream. At least there was room to stretch here without putting your fist in somebody's face. He stopped in front of the suit up area, took a deep breath. When this one was finished, they'd be headed for a full week of R&R, their first real break in months. Most stops were overnighters, supply pickups or transfers. They could all use the rest. In spite of himself, he could already feel the adrenaline starting to tingle through his veins, singing to the glories of the hunt. Apparently his body wasn't hip to how crazy stupid all of this was. Not that it ever had been. been. A couple of years ago, he couldn't wait for the feel of a hot pulse rifle in his hands, set against the hissing shrieks of the enemy. A few years before that, smuggling and gangbanging were his drugs of choice. Anything that spelled trouble and a chance to fuck with death. Oh yeah, he'd been a hard ass once. Now he watched the time, marking out the months he had left until parole. The skin over his implant was itching lately, and he wanted it gone. 8 more after this, and time served. Starting now, numbnuts. You have a crew to lead, and they're both looking to you to keep them alive. You gonna do that? Or are you gonna stand here tripping all day in the fucking hall? Hail Mary, he mumbled, and tapped the entry keypad. Second Lieutenant Catherine Lara ran her hands across the keys and sent the first in a series of hailers to Treon, Deep 4 specifically. She barely had to think about it anymore, practically muscle memory. Weyland-Yutani Cruiser Nemesis, HK Berserker Team inbound, ETA blah blah blah, frequencies and codes and stats, data entry at its most basic. She was suffused with a bizarre combination of emotional tension and physical lethargy. Her shoulders ached. This wasn't what she'd had in mind throughout her long, often psychotically paced training. The joy of punching code and running communications for a corporate lease ship. The cause was valid, sure, but lately she was hard-pressed to rationalize the methods. Teep, for example. I'm late for a most important date, Teep sang softly, his low voice broadcasting clearly through the small cockpit. Speak of the devil. Lara smiled vaguely, but could hear the strain in his voice, the carefully checked fear behind her. Pop laughed. Lara glanced up at a one-way monitor and quickly looked back at her computer screen. Teep and Jess were tightening their armor already, but Pulaski was still padding around in his jock, simultaneously chewing on a Mars bar and unself-consciously scratching one huge and tightly muscled buttock. The Candyman was a testosterone dork, almost a giant without even the obvious years of bodybuilding and steroids. Big-time macho right down to the buzzed white mohawk and a tattoo of a snake on his arm. Not someone she particularly wanted to watch scratching his butt. Let Pop keep an eye on things for a while. You want to light a fire down there, Pulaski? Pop had apparently been doing just that. Lara glanced over her shoulder. He was already focused back on the controls, piloting easily towards Treon. Light this, said Pulaski, and laughed loudly. Lara didn't bother to look up at this time. She could guess what he was holding besides the perpetual candy bar. A list of stats and a form letter acknowledgement scrolled up in front of her as Deep 4 picked up its channel of choice. She punched in the return formalities and logged a few numbers, trying to tune out some of the tense laughter that pulsed over the intercom as the boys got themselves geared. This was her 7th run on the Nemesis with Pop, their 5th with this particular threesome. A solemn male voice interrupted her thoughts. This is Treon, Weyland-Yutani, Deep 4, hailing Nemesis, over. Lara tapped her mic. Treon, Deep 4, you got hunter-killer Nemesis on an inward bounder, requesting landing coordinates. Can't tell you how glad we are to see a Berserker team, Nemesis. Coordinates sent and LZ is clear. Jess and Pulaski were laughing over something, and she warily looked up at the locker vid. Pulaski had pants on at least. They were a pretty good group, all in all, a cut above what she'd come to expect. Martin Jess was straddling one end of the locker room bench, grinning easily. Tall, brown-skinned, and with a winning laugh and some military experience, he was a solid ground leader, one of those calming crisis types who excelled in keeping up team spirit. Although not particularly well educated, he was sharp and alert in his work. High intelligence marks for his parole distributor. Jess looked up at the cam, still grinning. Hey Pop, you hear that? Teep wants to know, how come they can't train a dog to do his job? Pulaski cut in. And he told him, because they can't find a dog dumb enough to volunteer. Teep smiled tightly, his thin, pale face outlined by a dark scruff of beard. The cuff of his right ear was pierced with thick steel hoops, his spiky hair pushed back over shaved sides. Teep was the youngest member of the team. Yeah, you're a real funny guy, Jess. I'll lie awake nights and laugh about that one. Lara could tell he was sweating, in spite of the cool temperature in the locker room. Pulaski was finally struggling into his armor, the legend, "Eat Me," scrawled across one massive shoulder guard. Well, I ain't dumb, and I volunteered. Teep and Jess exchanged a smirking glance, and Teep sighed. Borderline psychotics don't count, Candyman. Since their intelligence isn't called into play over decisions like HK sign-up, it'll be reflexive. Jess cracked up. Teep played it straight as usual. He was probably the wittiest of the three, which was good. Lara had theorized that the betas with decent senses of humor did better than those without. Teep held it together pretty well, all things considered. I don't remember no mention of the word borderline, Pulaski said, then laughed boredly. He picked up an M41 and pumped the action on the grenade launcher, the well-oiled metal snapping sharply. Pop spoke up behind her, sounding amused. That's what I like, a happy crew. I'm gonna miss you little rays of sunshine when I'm gone. Ellis seemed like a nice kid, shy, straggling with some of the same career choices as her. They talked a few times over coffee about assignments, and she'd filled him in on a few tidbits of HK etiquette while they swapped info on Mac. facts. He was as interested in the SOP as she was about the robotics. Ellis's soft, clear voice filled the room. Still in deep sedation, sir. Respiratory and cardio rate even. No REMs. You want me to run a full systems check, Commander? Lara winced slightly, and Pop's icily bland reply spoke volumes. That would be helpful, son. We may be needing him soon. He calmed off sharply and scoffed. 26 missions, and they saddle me with Ellis. What does the guy do all day? Lara shrugged, but didn't turn around. He's green, but he's got the training. Give him a chance. Pop laughed softly, and she could tell he was shaking his head gently, as if to say, yeah, whatever, babe. He raised his voice suddenly, his standard go-get-em tone at full volume, and he addressed the team. We're there in 5. Belt up, boot up, and get ready to roll, people. God, he was starting to annoy her. Sleeping with him had been a serious mistake.
Looking specifically at Insider number 39, cover dated March 95, there's a fair amount of Aliens and Predator content here. You've got the reprint edition Aliens Mondo Pest, which we of course covered in the midst of the Colonial Marines episode. Continuing to have solicitations for Aliens Berserker. There's a solicitation for Aliens vs. Predator Duel, 1 of 2. You've got the one-shot Predator Jungle Tales. That's specifically covering stories that were in Dark Horse Comics number 1 through 2 and 10 through 12. Solicitation copy for Aliens Berserker number 2 of 4 reads, the Nemesis team hunts and destroys alien hives, small, medium, or large. But Terminal 949 carried a crew of nearly 1,000 people, and that makes it the biggest hive in history. It would be a touch-and-go situation even with a properly functioning Berserker unit. And this particular slaughter machine has been showing some problems lately. No backup, no cavalry, and no hope. But there's one slim chance they can make it out alive if they're willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. Written by John Wagner, penciled by Paul Mendoza, inked by Andy Mushinsky, colored by Kerry Porter, painted cover by Killian Plunkett. Shipping February 21st, 1995. Miniseries is written by John Wagner, best known as the co-creator of Judge Dredd, the fascist satire from 2000 AD. Been made into a couple of movies that will be relevant later on because he will be returning to write the Aliens Judge Dredd miniseries when that comes about. Normally we would expect some sort of forward to the trade paperback from Mr. Wagner, but as with Music of the Spears, there is no trade paperback. This story will not be collected until the Aliens Omnibus Volume 4. It was supposed to run in Aliens magazine, but it was canceled before that started, and so it'd take from 1995 to 2008 before this miniseries gets a reappraisal. Also, once collected, it's retitled Frenzy. Now, as you'll recall, a bunch of the Aliens trades were retitled because they featured the characters of Ripley, Hicks, and Newt after Aliens 3 had revealed that none of those characters make it out of that movie alive, and so they went around and they changed everybody's names for the most part, or came up with reasons why you could have a duplicate Ripley running around, for instance. So, not a fan of the practice, but it makes sense. It lets you know that this is an altered version from the original version, except that to my knowledge, there's no alterations done from the Aliens Berserker 4-issue miniseries to the Aliens Frenzy collection of that miniseries within the Aliens Omnibus. I don't have copies of Berserker. I had to read it through the Aliens Omnibus, so if they had changed the name of things, I would have probably taken notice of that. Frenzy has nothing to do with anything in the story. I don't think the word frenzy is used at any point in the story. It's not the title of the ship. It's not the title of the mech. So it's just needlessly confusing because there is no trade paperback to reference. It's just a reprint of this miniseries in a collection of other miniseries. Why would you do that? But getting back to John Wagner, he's a frequent collaborator with Alan Grant. I've never been a fan of Alan Grant's writing, but I seem to like it a little bit better when he's working with Wagner. I've read some of Wagner's stuff on his own. He doesn't blow me away, but I tend to prefer him over Grant when I've been exposed to him. Of all things, I think the main thing I read of his was the Chain Gang War, which was intended to be an ongoing series, ended up being more like a miniseries. It was a book DC put out in the early 90s. Yes, and of course it got an embossed foil cover at some point. Early artwork by Dave Johnson, probably never going to be collected, in part because the material is co-owned by the creators and DC, which allowed them to feature DC characters, but prevents the creators from going off and printing it anyplace else. And I don't see DC up and deciding they want to have a Chain Gang War collection. I don't think there's any significant demand for that, but that was an okay book. I didn't follow the whole thing, but I read it for a little while. The art in the story is by Paul Mendoza. You may remember that he drew the Alien strip from Dark Horse Comics, which I covered in one of the Omnibus episodes with my father. My father was not a fan of his artwork. I liked it quite a bit. I really enjoyed the level of detailing. I liked the cartooniness of it. It was a different kind of alien story. A lot of it took place in bright sunlight. If I recall correctly, one of his covers was used as the the cover for one of the Marvel Aliens the Original Years omnibuses. I think it was volume 2. I didn't get that cover. I went with the one with the new artwork as opposed to the reprint artwork, but still pretty nifty. Inks are in here by Andy Muschinsky. I'm not familiar with his work. I don't recall if he inked the previous story. And then the lettering is by Steve Dutro. And I want to point this out because this is one of those instances where lettering is usually an invisible art. You don't tend to notice it. And more often than not, if you do notice it, then that's a failing. And that's why I'm calling it out here. I think it's still hand lettering, although sometimes it does look like it might be a little bit of early digital stuff. It's really, really comic booky. Lots of big sound effects, bursts within dialogue balloons when people are talking. For instance, when they're going in, there's a stylized font explodes out of the balloon that says "Bug Hunt," and then later on they're getting to the hive and they're like, "We've hit the mother lode." Just way too goofy. It doesn't suit the material very well. This is something we're going to come back to throughout our discussion of this miniseries. It just kept bugging me. I shouldn't be bothered by the letters. You really kind of have to go out of bounds. It looked like he was trying to do sort of a Tom Orzechowski thing, particularly his work in Spawn. Obviously his lettering works well in a book like Spawn, not so much in an Aliens comic. Colors were by Carrie Porter. It's not a great looking book in that regard. The colors are, at least in this edition, very flat and very bright and sometimes too pale. There's sort of a pastel quality to a lot of it, or a washed out quality, and everything's just so bright. Having an Aliens movie under high beam fluorescence, it just doesn't look right. Because I have the credits right in front of me, I want to take a minute and kind of go one by one, and then we'll come back to more detailed stuff later on. So the second story starts with a dream sequence where Tempe is picturing himself having his face mask melted by a drone. All the crew around him are pretty much dead, but the corpses are still talking, so by the second page, you're in a dream sequence. Cut to the lady Laura and the nerdy guy Ellis. They're looking at the Max unit. They're talking about how this thing's got problems. They're having to give it insulin. It's not major at this particular moment in time, but they're both concerned about it, particularly Laura. She's the one who sort of needles Ellis for not communicating that there were some issues there, especially as they're about to go into this major mission. There's a big one-page splash of the space station. They like to make a big deal about this as the largest base ever to have an infestation of aliens. Once they get inside, there's some really gory moments. As I mentioned, the colors are so bright and light that when you have deep red from these bodies being splayed all over the place and lots of detail as far as what horrible things have been done to the bodies, there's a lot of instances where alien blood has melted through these smooth Starfleet corridors, even more than the more industrial qualities you have with the grading in the Aliens movies. It seems out of place for there to just be these black holes of suck amidst these polished hallways. I'm a gore hound and when it comes to movies and stuff anyway, and certainly I'm pretty inured to anything they typically have in the Aliens comics, but that contrast was very striking. At one point, they open up some doors and there's just like dozens and dozens of face huggers coming out all at once. It's actually depicted on one of the covers, the Killian Plunkett covers. Kind of new, not really something we've seen before, but also the reason is when you think about it, it's stupid. We've seen the alien eggs enough times to know that they are dormant until they are triggered by whether it's heat or light or body temperature or touch or sound or whatever causes the eggs to hatch. They don't just hatch en masse. And again, you could do that. That'd be a cool scene. You get somebody with a bunch of eggs and they're like surrounded by all these eggs and then they all start to open up at once, like they're commanded by their queen, for instance. That could be cool. To just have a random door open up and a bunch of these things come skittering out, why? They don't have any idea of how many people have come aboard. There's no reason we can see clearly of why they would know that there are people aboard yet and how many there would be and how many eggs would need to hatch. And why would you have a bunch of hatched eggs in a room that's relatively close to the entranceway that the people are coming through? Usually the hives are deeper into whatever location they are. Also, it's creepy when one or two or three facehuggers are coming at you, but when you've got like dozens all at once and there's multiple guys with heavy machine guns, they're just running around strafing, and so instead of being scary, it just looks like video game stuff. There's an important setup where the punk rock dude with the white mohawk is digging around in the refrigerator and finds some Dom Perignon, or I think they call it Dominion. He's wanting to celebrate a little preemptively, but they're like, nah, put it back in the fridge. We'll get to that later on. We will. Chekhov's bottle of booze. Mohawk guy had also been talking about how he wanted to get the chance to actually kill some aliens instead of just sending the Max unit in to blow everything away. Because of the scale of this operation, they've actually got the not colonial marines, the exterminators, going in first, getting a lay of the land and figure out where things are. It's not as simple as having their bait get taken, because they have to find, there's a MacGuffin. There was a communications problem where there was information that was supposed to be communicated. It wasn't. The communications expert, the lady, she goes in there and she finds that the communications has actually been intentionally cut. So that's suspicious. And they're trying to find data that Weyland-Yutani wants. It's specifically Weyland-Yutani who's ordering these guys to go on board the ship. One clear problem is that these guys are not doing their standard operating procedure stuff. It's not a simple go in there, find the hive, kill the queen, get back out situation. They're sort of all over the place, and they're not necessarily used to that. Obviously, Candyman is a guy who's into using his weapons, so he's a little bit more adept at this, but a lot of the other guys maybe struggle with that a little bit. There's also a big thing where they find this waterfall, woods artificially crafted, this beautiful little vacation spot. They're talking about, oh wow, this is incredible. I've never seen anything like this, except if you've been reading Deadliest of the Species, the Chris Claremont miniseries. They have a luxury ship where they also have one of these things, so it just feels a little bit like, oh, if we're following the Aliens books, we've been here before for sure. But one thing they didn't get to do a lot of in that book is have aliens running around within that environment. The aliens return to the cover of Dark Horse Insider with May 1995's number 41. This is to promote their crossover with Superman, and features a cover by, I assume, Dan Jurgens and definitely Kevin Nolan. Still a quality production, but the page count is definitely less. It's a lighter comic book, 32 pages this time rather than 48. Still putting out Madman comics by Mike Allred. You've got a trade paperback collection of the Virus miniseries, very much inspired by Aliens type material, and eventually adapted into a motion picture as part of Dark Horse's initiative on that front. Interestingly, we have the resolicitation of Vision's The Art of Arthur Sidem. Now it's shipping May 9th, 1995 with a $29.95 cover price. I think that was the original price. I'm not going back to check. Issue 11 of Deadliest of the Species. Issue 1 of Aliens vs. Predator War. Godzilla's coming back for a couple of issues. There's a Tarzan one-shot, A Tale of Mugambi, featuring painted artwork by Igor Corday, or Cordy. Really nice artist, not treated well by our industry, particularly the X-Men office. Still eking out Shadow miniseries. Got an Indiana Jones miniseries, Spear of Destiny, by Elaine Lee and Dan Spiegel. This one offers the likeness of Sean Connery as Henry Jones, I recall. Is that the name of the dad? I don't know. Everybody else loves that movie more than I do. The Mask series by Arquidian Monkey continues to be represented in Dark Horse Insider, the Dark Horse Comics Greatest World books, now referred to as Dark Horse Heroes. They're all present. X, Mecha got a one-shot. Ages of Law launched out of the crossover I talked about. Ghost got a relaunch. The first series of Gunsmith Cats is offered by Kenichi Sonoda and Tomoko Saito. I know that ran for quite a few years. We sold a fair few of those at our shop. Not so much my first shop. It was big at the second shop. Solicitation copy for Aliens Berserker number 3 of 4. We have found paradise, and it is contaminated. If I recall correctly, that's a line from the book. The crew of the spaceship Nemesis face off against the mother of all hives in a barrel-blazing, thermonuclear, blowout bonanza. An outer space station paradise has been infested, and this issue they unload all they've got to make a clean sweep of the station. But the bugs apparently aren't the only problem in paradise. A traitor walks among them. Can they blow away the bugs and keep the knives out of their backs? Or is paradise lost? Monthly, shipping March 21st, 1995. Eventually, probably inevitably, the exterminator forces get overwhelmed. The communications gal is trying to get the equipment set back up again, and a face hugger comes after her. She's got some sort of a soldering iron thing that she uses to stab the face hugger, but it's still coming at her. So finally, she managed to shut it up in a refrigerator, and because it's wounded, its acid blood seems to melt part of the metal on the refrigerator and sort of seal it shut. Seems pretty unlikely. Metal tends to take a little bit of time to cool and harden. I think a face hugger has enough strength to push open a refrigerator. It's not even like a freezer where there's some sort of a locking mechanism. It looks like a dorm refrigerator, so it should have been able to pop that thing right back open again. We learned that it was a Weyland-Yutani trader vessel that brought the infestation on board the bigger ship. Supposedly this information would ruin Weyland-Yutani forever, destroy the company, and that's one of the major reasons for all the secrecy. The punk rock guy, Candyman, he's killed. The bait guy and the black guy both get captured by drones and taken to the main hive. They fire up the Max unit, but the pilot inside has died. We're definitely now deep in the shit. So getting back to Paul Mendoza. As I mentioned, I really enjoyed his work in the Alien strip. In that book, he was pretty much exclusively drawing various aliens, and so he could go nuts with the designs, with the detailing. Looking at this book, he definitely enjoys drawing the aliens, and there's a lot of detail there. He likes drawing the mechs, particularly the Max suit. There's a lot of detail there, a lot of gore. When it comes to the human beings, though, it's surprisingly light in detail. The faces are differentiated, so that's good, but they're not highly rendered. The suits aren't highly rendered. The ships especially, it's interesting. The spaceships, the ATV nudity, the other equipment that we see, it looks like blueprints. You can see why, my understanding is that he went into film and animation. I think he does storyboards and design work and stuff. If you're trying to make a toy and you're looking for a design to build a drop ship, this is a great place to look because the line work is very clear. The specifics are all there, but there's no cool cross-hatching. There's no battle damage, bright studio lighting. So there's no shadows being cast anywhere. There's no mood. And you couple that with the bright coloring, there's just nothing scary about this. There's no vibe. It really, to me, looks like a G.I. Joe comic. Like, this would have been good artwork for the book that Dark Horse is going to do in the near future, the reboot of G.I. Joe. Again, not super flashy and certainly much more violent than you'd allow for G.I. Joe. You combine the bright coloring, the light artwork, the wacky lettering, the fact that this material is extremely derivative. We've already seen a better version of this story, written by Dave Gibbons, painted by Dave Dorman. You're not competing with that. I gotta say, the reading of the book is easy enough. It's not challenging. It's not a slog or anything. I went through these issues very quickly. It was smooth. It was fine. But very much like Stronghold and the whole Rogue Labyrinth situation, I'm watching reruns. And I know it's new material being produced, but the new material isn't new. I don't want to say it's like tracing Alien with Alien's Covenant. It's definitely better by comparison to the source material than those two movies are, but it's a similar vibe. It's like, haven't we done this before? Why are we going to this well again? Don't we have anything new to offer? We don't even have the twist of, it's the Grant Corporation, so it's tying into more of the continuity of the comic books. Like, no, it's Weyland-Yutani. Everybody knows Weyland-Yutani. Go to a convention, buy the patch, buy the satchel, whatever you want. Everything is exactly what you'd expect it to be. There's no surprises here. A couple months later, Big Guy and Rusty the Boy Robot are getting started. Frank Miller, Jeff Darrow. It eventually did get an animated adaptation, not very long lasting. I don't even think it got a full season. Deadliest of the Species finally ends. Race War gets a trade paperback collection. They're doing the adaptation of the Species movie, which literally featured designs from H.R. Giger rather than just having people trying to rip them off, as they did for most of the 80s. Shadow has a team up with Doc Savage by Steve Vance and Stan Manoukian with Vince Rocher. Never read it myself. We've got the launch of Star Wars X-Wing Rogue Squadron, one of the longest ongoing series, or really ongoing series, a miniseries, but ongoing series that they ever did among the Star Wars titles. Droids is going, River of Chaos is going, The Mask is getting miniseries to go along with the ongoing series. Solicitation copy for Aliens Berserker number 4. It's down to the wire now, and with more casualties than firepower, the crew of the Nemesis find themselves hip deep in trouble and watching the next load coming. Their Berserker unit is a slug of cold, dead steel, and their only hope lies in the direction they least expect. Don't miss this mile-a-minute slash and burn finale to the most pyrokinetic aliens adventure ever. Ships April 18th, 1995. The Max suit had been designed to take on a new pilot in case of emergency. Ellis sacrificed himself, a needle boring into the back of his head, and he slowly gained control of the Max. To some degree, the unit piloted itself, and the more he fought with that impulse, the harder it was for him. Laura coached him to calm down, let the machine do what it's doing. Bugs start getting splattered all over the place. Explosions, fire. The Max unit's making its way to the hive. It's too late for TP though. They managed to pry the mask off of him. He's got a face hugger on. Black Guy Jess, he's mounted up next to him. He's still like, hey, it's too late for my buddy, but could you come get me, please? The Max unit next to the Queen blows the Queen away. It's literally one page he gets there, second page, big almost splash, blows away the Queen. Acid blood washes onto Tempe. His half melted by the time it's all said and done, so he was dead one way or the other. With some effort, Ellis and the Max unit managed to cut Jess free. Pop takes an away ship, lands on the larger vessel. Jess and the Max unit start fighting their way back toward the entrance slash exit. Pop meets up with Laura and starts setting up a nuclear device to blow everything up. Laura's like, great, we need to blow this up, but also we got the guys coming. And Pop's like, don't care, they're gonna die. And so what it turns out is that he'd been ordered to take out the base and all the witnesses once he had the data that Weyland-Yutani needed. His rationale is that he'd been told that if word ever got out, Weyland-Yutani would be ruined, and therefore his and Laura's careers would be ruined. And also he loves Laura and he wants to have a life with her, so he made it part part of the deal that she could survive, but nobody else is going to survive. And Laura's not cool with that and fights him. He draws on her. He's like, look, now you may not be feeling this, but later on you'll be glad that you survived this. She's like, dude, they're going to try to kill us both. You don't have a future. And he's like, no, it's going to be great. Let me just open up this refrigerator and get the wine out. It's going to be awesome. Champagne and face hugger. Surprise, surprise, surprise. With Pops incapacitated, Laura goes and does her best to help out. She gets the away ship set up. Jess and the Max make it on board. Cue a blurb that's probably added just for the omnibus. See Aliens vs. Predator Omnibus Volume 2 for further developments.
Chapter 30. Lara was pushed back into her seat as the shuttle rocketed from the terminal and into the blackness. She pushed the controls to the maximum, horribly and totally aware that each second mattered, that even one of them would mean the difference between life and death. Nemesis! Jess shouted. No time. Failsafe's gonna go any second. And if we're not out of initial EMP range, we're going to go with it. For an eternity of tense silence, they waited. Lara watched the distance elapse in a line of growing numbers across the shuttle's small system monitor, dismally waiting for it all to shut down as they were caught in the shock, and the tiny shuttle reached minimum safe distance. Lara stared at the numbers in disbelief, opened her mouth to tell them, and DS Terminal 949 exploded. A white, hot light blasting across the visual monitors as the nuclear device triggered the station's reactor. The intense light hung suspended, a swirling mass of burning air and ash, and then it was all gone. Lara collapsed against her seat and looked numbly at the controls, the elation draining away with the souring adrenaline as she caught her breath. Behind her, Jess fumbled at the Max suit. Lara punched up the shuttle's stats, felt the last of her relief dwindle and fade as she tapped in numbers and read the results. They had about 3 days before the air recycler stopped working. She sighed, closed her eyes, and discovered that the thought wasn't so terrible, that she didn't still have hope. A lot can happen in 3 days. The worst of the nightmare had to be over, and if they'd gotten this far, they might as well pretend that they could make it a little farther. Stranger things had happened. It ain't over till it's over, or so they say. Lara smiled faintly and sat up straighter at the console. She punched up the distress beacon and set it to automatic, then called up navigation and started to lay in coordinates wearily. Jess eased Ellis out of the suit and cradled his weightless form gently. The kid looked like shit. Blood formed tiny droplets in the air around his face. Hair matted to his fragile-looking skull in red-stained sweat. His eyes were closed, and although he breathed deep and even, he didn't wake up. Ellis, can you hear me? No answer. But one of his eyelids fluttered at the sound of Jess's rasping voice, and his pulse was strong and fluid. Whatever the suit had done to his mind, Ellis's body had come through, for what it's worth. We're in deep space on a transport shuttle. Our chances are up to 0.01% of a billion. Ellis mumbled softly and fell silent and still again, unconscious or just deeply asleep. Jess didn't know. The suit had fucked something up inside of the young tech, and only time would tell if he was going to pull out of it. You saved us, kid. No matter what happens now, you saved us. He held on to Ellis's relaxed body and tried to believe the hard part was over. Let the clean air fill him up, the tension leaving his body with each deep exhalation. Will he live? Lara asked, sounding as tired as he felt. I don't know. As long as any of us, I guess. Lara answered musingly, a voice weary and sad, but not despairing. Not yet. Why did this happen? That's what I want to know. What information was so important to the company that they were willing to sacrifice all of us, even a Max? Jess shook his head. Doesn't matter much now, does it? Everything's gone. For a moment, there was only silence. Jess stared down at the kid's still face and wondered if it was worth it. Wondered if there was any point to it all. Unless they got picked up in a few days, they'd be dead, and only the company knew that they were out here. When Lara spoke again, Jess was surprised to hear a grin in her voice. Know any good jokes? He was just as surprised by his own smile as they sped through the ocean of dark, a speck of dust in a silent sea. We'll have to make some up, he said, and closed his eyes for a while.
So again, not my favorite read, but not terrible. It's one of those deals where it just feels like a missed opportunity and also very manufactured. It's like, oh, okay, we want to have the Tribes characters be continuing characters in some other epic, so we're just going to respawn them and then set them up for a tie-in book. If I'd known that this was going to directly relate to another series, I'd have probably just waited to cover it. Unfortunately, there just wasn't time to move on to the next episode to get that set up. The co-host is still reading the material. I haven't even started reading the material yet because the plan was always to do this one. I waited until the weekend that I'm editing the episode to read the material, so I just didn't know. It's okay. We're going to have a nice little lag. If it actually bled directly into the story in publication, but we don't need to do that. These characters aren't that important. We'll be able to talk about them later on when we cover them in that material. One thing that bugged me about the story is that they make such a big deal about the size of this vessel that's been infested, how there's more people who've been captured and impregnated than in any other circumstance, and yet as handful of people just kind of waltz in and waltz out, relatively speaking. When you got thousands, if not tens of thousands of drones running around, when you've got a queen, when you have all this open space, it just shouldn't be this easy. It should be very intimidating, and it's not, because the art doesn't sell it, the writing doesn't sell it. It feels like there are plot points being communicated, but the follow through isn't there. I just wish they hadn't tried to set such a large scale, and therefore they wouldn't have to match what they're setting up. This could have just been a particularly bad job, or too soon job, or job done without the proper equipment. This just could have been a little better thought out and could have played more effectively. I ain't mad at it. It's fine. It didn't piss me off. It didn't irritate me that much. It just feels like a wasted opportunity, and you definitely feel like the sputtering out of the Aliens line. It's playing out in the narrative the way it's playing out in the publishing history. So I pull out my copy of Dark Horse Insider number 45, September 1995, and there's a clear difference with this book versus the previous books. It's the same length as the most recent issues at 30 pages, but this is on a very brown, very thin, very cheap newsprint. These were giveaway books that were usually found on comic book store counters. This very much feels like that, where some of these other ones were much more substantial. They were talking about the trade collection of Brian Talbot's The Tale of One Bad Rat, which is also cover featured, and there's an interview with him as well. There's another American Splendor book. You've got the Octane miniseries written by the infamous Gerard Jones with art by Gene Ha. We do get some Aliens presence with Dark Horse Presents number 101, which features a Bernie Wrightson Aliens cover and interior story as well, a little short story. We'll cover that eventually. On Star Wars front, they've added the Sith War miniseries. They try to make a brief go of it with Doc Savage, written by Steve Vance, art by Pat Broderick. Would like to get a look at that one. That'd be cool. Never seen it in the wild to my recollection. For the rebranded Comics Greatest World, now called Dark Horse Heroes, they've launched the Motorhead series, and they've added The Mark, which was a one of the earliest things that Dark Horse ever published, certainly superhero material, written by Todd Johnson, drawn by Larry Stroman, so he's the creative team behind Tribes. This is another one that I don't think I've ever seen on the shelves. I don't remember ordering many, if any, for the shops. Solicited in this issue is X number 18, the final chapter of the Hunting the Heroes crossover. We'll be talking about that very soon. If you've been following the podcast for a while, you know that usually I get through 3 or 4 of these Dark Horse Insiders as I'm talking about a miniseries. We'll kind of do a State of Dark Horse, and then we'll dive into the solicitation copy, that sort of thing. But you notice I'm going through a whole bunch of issues all of a sudden with a real lack of Aliens or Predator content. It's sort of like an asterisk, especially here towards the end. And again, I've wondered about this. I'm sure some of it was just oversaturation. There were so many Aliens products in 1993. I've talked about this many times at this point. A good chunk of the podcast episodes to date have been books from 1993, whether they began there or ended there. The Predator sequel came out to an underwhelming response. The Alien sequel came out to a broadly negative response. By this time, the toy line has come and gone. There aren't any more video games being made, I think, at this point. Interest in both the Aliens and Predator comics seems to have tapered off. There's no Dark Horse comics anymore. We're not getting routine miniseries anymore, much less multiple series at the same time. And even the Aliens versus Predator content, which seemed like it took a long time to get back to, and obviously we're going to have to address that in the future as well. That's come and it's gone for the most part in these issues of Dark Horse Insider. And then that brings us to December 1995's number 48. It has a Frank Miller cover of G.I. Joe. Really, it's a silhouette with a raggedy American flag around it, which I thought was a situation like you had with the Reign of the Superman, where they didn't want to reveal what the Superman looked like, so they just did a silhouette. But it turns out Frank Miller just cashed a big check for a little bit of that work, because we never see any drawings within this big black blotch of an outline of a soldier. It's probably worth noting that right here on the cover it says Final Issue Farewell. There's an Indiana Jones Inside front cover, and then the next page is a brief editorial featuring Arthur Siden's art from this volume of Dark Horse Insider's first issue. Final Issue Farewell. This issue of the Insider is the last issue you'll see in this format. We're changing from the comic-sized magazine you've known for the last 4 years to a poster format. The all-new Insider will feature a beautiful 11x17 color poster on one side with information and full-color art on all of our new series, one-shots and trades on the flip side, along with a handy checklist of all Dark Horse monthly titles. We'll even fit in a nifty feature each month. The new Insider for January 96 will boast Bruce Timm's fabulous cover to Adventures of the Mask number 1 as the poster. Ask for it at your comic shop. For complete summaries on all Dark Horse titles each month, there's Diamond Previews catalog, also available from your local comics retailer. Dark Horse is taking the lead in designing its own section in previews. You'll find summaries on all of our books, fascinating creator interviews, installments of continuing series, and a great mix of editorial features, all presented with the polished style and quality you've come to expect from Dark Horse. And see, this is probably an important note, because if you follow the evolution of retailer catalogs, they were fairly bare bones in the early days, pretty much just a plot blurb. Those plot blurbs got longer and longer over time, but mostly a little bit of feature art and plot blurbs, and the publishers didn't necessarily have a lot of say in how that was put across. I don't know if they had to pay something extra to get those little art pieces on the page, or if there was a certain allotment that was given to them. Obviously, the retail catalog is going to want artwork. They don't want to just be plain text. They need to sell this product too, and the art's a big part of that. But things like layout and depth of information and spotlights and full page pieces and stuff, that wasn't something comic publishers had a lot of say in for a long time. But then you had the distributor wars, where Marvel bought Heroes World and therefore was their own distribution network with their own catalog they designed for themselves. And then that prompted a battle mostly between Diamond Previews and Capital City Advanced Comics as to who was going to get the rest of the market. Everybody essentially watched DC to see where they went, because everybody knew that wherever DC went, that distributor would be safe, and there were no guarantees with any other distributors. Image played the field for a while, and others talked for a bit there of them going to Capital City, but ultimately DC Comics not only went with Diamond, but they also had a contract that allowed them the option to potentially buy the distribution company if they chose to do the same thing that Marvel had done. Once they did that, every other major publisher went to Diamond as well, but they were clearly able to negotiate terms that were favorable to them. I know Image Comics already had a lot of leeway, it seemed like. They bought so many ads, full page ads in previews, that they had a lot of control over how their books were represented because of the advertisements. I want to say at one point Acclaim, aka Valiant Comics, was exclusive to Advanced Comics, but that didn't last very long at all, if it ever happened. Might be a fever dream of mine. But with Dark Horse, obviously they had the Insider, and the great thing about the Insider is it's a free giveaway book. You're probably getting into more hands than a previews. In my experience, a lot of people who were into comics, especially in the 90s, never looked at the catalogs. They looked at what was on the shelves, or they grabbed whatever was free on the counter, and that's how you got those people. And that's myself included. When I was a kid, I didn't have money. Before I was getting catalogs, my brother would get comic shop news, and he'd collect a bunch of them, and that's how I'd keep abreast of the industry, is reading what he got from his comic shop. When I would manage to get to a comic shop, or at one of the flea markets that I used to buy my books from, they would have the DC Direct Currents, which was their little advertorial booklet. I have to point out too, much less substantial than Dark Horse. Dark Horse gave themselves a lot more space to push material more effectively. At the same time though, DC's book was entirely on glossy color stock, so they could make their images pop, where Dark Horse's interiors were pretty much always black and white. So pros and cons. Setting that aside though, you've got an industry in collapse, you've got money no longer flowing, it costs money to put out a free periodical. So if your distributor is saying, hey look, we're going to let you just design your own so long as you're exclusive to us, Dark Horse presumably cut that deal. And so it's like, okay, we don't need the expense of this anymore. So let me go back to the material. Let's see. But wait, there's more. The horse is on the net. Dark Horse has its own page on the web, and Dark Horse Internet Coordinator Michael Winston has been busy filling it with all kinds of great information and eye-popping graphics. And soon I'll be working with Michael to incorporate some of the features we've presented in the Insider, like the horse's mouth, onto our website page. I'm quite excited about that. Next time you're surfing the web, check out http://www.dhorse.com/. I think you'll be excited too. I gotta tell you, I first started having internet access when my buddy Mac and his brother and his family got a web TV. We checked out a lot of stuff on the internet in those days. We never went to dhorse.com. I'm not sure if I went there with my own internet access at any point in the aughts. I know I've gone there a bunch of times in recent years because of this podcast, but never a big destination for me. Not the place where I ever got news from. I don't think it's a super effective way to promote your books. Anyway, we may be saying goodbye to the old Insider, but we're saying hello to an all-new Insider and introducing 2 new terrific Dark Horse vehicles as well. Take your pick and take them all. I've had a lot of fun editing the Insider and have learned so much since we published the first issue 4 years ago. So much of what I've learned has come from you, the readers. Thanks for sharing your compliments and criticisms, your stories, your art, and your knowledge and love for this great medium. I can only hope it's been a two-way street. Keep reading, Chris Young. And so we've got Madman Comics number 10 with an Alex Ross painted cover. Got a Sin City the Big Fat Kill hardcover collection. We've got the Cross miniseries by Andrew Vox. Grindel Tales, That Will Make Hair number 1 by Terry Laban and Peter Doherty. Dark Horse Presents number 104. No Aliens, No Predator. Once again, Visions, The Art of Arthur Sidum. This time $99.95 because it's a deluxe hardcover limited edition. So that indicates that at least that first edition finally came out. Last spring, in celebration of his accomplishments, Dark Horse released an oversized quality paperback art book collecting Sidum's work. The release of this collection has has met with high praise from art lovers everywhere. Now, by special arrangement with Alexander Gallery, we were able to offer a hardcover edition of this book featuring high-quality binding, a custom full-color dust jacket, and special illustrated signature page. This edition is limited to 1,000 copies. Boy, wouldn't you love for a hardcover book to get to 1,000 copies from a comic book publisher in this day and age? It's stated in here, too, that the edition is available now. No longer has an Aliens cover. I think this is from Mudwogs. They were doing a variety of Tex Avery-related materials in this time period. They've got a miniseries for Tex Avery's Droopy. Prior to that, they had the Wolf in Red miniseries. I remember buying the first issue of that, and they are featured in Droopy's final issue. Star Wars Droids is still coming out. There's the comic adaptation of Splinter of the Mind's Eye. I think the first Dark Horse novel released by Alan Dean Foster. X-Wing Rogue Squadron's carrying on. Boba Fett has a one-shot. Sith Wars carrying on. Heir to the Empire. Also an adaptation of a best-selling book, this time by Timothy Zahn. Godzilla, Indiana Jones and the Sargasso Pirates by Carl Kiesel and Paul Guinan, with inks by Eduardo Barreto. You got a hardcover edition of Tarzan the Lost Adventure. We've got Tarzan meets John Carter of Wars. I think I might have picked that one up too. That one was written by Bruce Jones with art by Brett Blevins. Ghost is carrying on, plus she's having a crossover with The Shadow. Motorhead, another masked miniseries. This one drawn by Gary Erskine, written by Robert Warren Fleming. X is still coming out. You're Under Arrest is getting started. Kusuke Fujishima. I don't remember that one being as big. I know it had some readers, but I don't remember that one being Gunsmith Cats big, which of course that's still going on. Did I mention 3x3 Eyes before? Anyway, that's out as well. So that's the last issue of Dark Horse Insider. I'm not going to say the end of an era because I think that the era has already begun to end. We're sort of in the terminal period of this era of Dark Horse. I did pick up a few of the Dark Horse poster format editions just to check them out, but they're pretty underwhelming. They don't have a lot of information. I don't have a lot of use for small quartered posters on my walls as a middle-aged man. And to be honest with you, I guess you had to pay for those in bundles, because with Dark Horse Insider, the book version, I seem to recall those being bound together with the various catalogs, the advanced comics, the diamond previews. I'm not certain of that, but I remember those being around, and I don't remember ever ordering them on their own. So maybe they weren't. Maybe I was just going to shops that were putting those two together as though they were a combination. I know that as a retailer, I never ordered that second version of Dark Horse Insider, and I really didn't recall seeing it in any other shops. So I just don't think it went over that well, and I think that just probably helped shrink an already shrinking market, specifically for Dark Horse. So let's look at the 1994 sales numbers. Aliens Music of the Spears #1 was ranked 98th in unit sales for January 1994 and 79th in dollar share. 5th place overall for Dark Horse. It sold almost 31% as well as that month's issue of Amazing Spider-Man, when that was the baseline for sales through Diamond Distribution. Diamond's competitor Capital City reported selling about 20,225 copies. Now, if I recall correctly, they're still in competition. Nobody's signed an exclusive contract yet, but also it doesn't look like Capital City's numbers were as good as Diamond's to begin with. So you may want to multiply that by 2 or 3 to get the overall sales, let's say somewhere in the realm of 60,000 to 80,000 copies. Aliens Music of the Spears #2 was ranked 123rd in unit sales for February 94 and 88th in dollar share. Again, 5th place for Dark Horse. It sold almost 21% as well as that month's Amazing Spider-Man, which means a 10% drop from the previous issue. Capital City reported selling about 16,150 copies. So within that distributor, you're looking at a loss of about 4,000 copies. Now, Music of the Spears falls out of the top 100 at this point, and I don't have Diamond numbers. All I can tell you is that Music of the Spears #3 sold 15,425 copies through Capital City and 15,175 copies. From 2 to 4, that's a loss of about 1,000 copies. But for comparison's sake, sometime around the same time period, Mondo Pest came out. That was a collection of the Kirk Mondo stories from Dark Horse Comics. That reprint edition sold 10,125 copies, and they did eventually do an all-new special to follow up on that, so I guess sales were decent enough by comparison. Then we look at Alien Stronghold #1 through Capital City, sold 18,075 copies. So that means that it's 2,000 copies off from where Capital City was with Music of the Spears #1, which I've already noted was not one of the better selling Aliens miniseries. So Stronghold goes further down into the hole. #2 sold 15,125 copies. So again, 1,000 copy difference from when Music of the Spears came out earlier in the same year. #3 sold 14,225 copies through Capital City. So that's a little over 1,000 between the two threes. And then it concluded its run at 13,400 copies, where Music of the Spears was still at 15,175 copies. So we're getting closer to a 2,000 copy disparity between the two series. And so what we're clearly seeing is a trajectory where the Aliens books are selling less and less with each new miniseries. Finally, we're at Berserker #1. That one sells 14,750 copies. That means a difference of about 5,500 copies from Music of the Spears to Berserker, and a little over 3,000 copies from Stronghold to Berserker. Berserker #2 sells 12,600 copies. Edition #2, it's already 800 copies below the final issue of Stronghold. #3 is 12,425 copies, so at least we have a bit of a hold there. 4 sells 12,125 copies. 3 of the 4 issues of Berserker remain in the 12,000 copy range, so there probably isn't much further to go. That's probably their floor, but their floor is almost half as many copies as Music of the Spears #1, which already, again, not a great seller. For comparison's sake, we had much of the run of Aliens, Predator, Deadliest of the Species in this same year. The 4th issue was January 1994's number 70 title in unit sales, 54th place in dollars. It was Dark Horse's 3rd bestseller after X #1 and Star Wars Tales of the Jedi #4. 2 months later, it was at 66th place, so not losing ground. I should also note that the capital city numbers for Deadliest of the Species #4, 24,375 copies. So the 4th issue sold about 4,000 copies more than the 1st issue of Music of the Spears, closer to 8,000 more than the 2nd issue. But it's also losing ground. By the time we get to #7 of Deadliest of the Species, it's down to about 19,025 copies. And December 94's #9 was at 17,800 copies, which means it's doing a minimum of 5,000 copies more than any of the mini-series that are running alongside that same period in 94. And of course, Aliens vs. Predator Deadliest of the Species is the only Aliens-related series that's staying in the top 100 in sales. Throughout that year, we've got 70th place, 66th place, 65th place, 92nd place, 77th place. The math on that is Aliens plus Predator plus Chris Claremont. Predator was also having a better year. Batman vs. Predator 2 Blood Match is one of the best-selling titles of 1994. Generously, we're talking like top 100 for the entire year, but still, the crossover is doing them some good. It remains to be seen how well Aliens vs. Superman is going to do. Clearly, Dark Horse is putting all their eggs in the crossover basket, because going forward, there are going to be some long gaps in alien representation in comics. From May through August of 1995, and then January 1996 has 0 Aliens comic books whatsoever. In December, we have the Aliens Mondo Heat one-shot, which was the last appearance of Kirk Mondo and featured all new material. From March through August and November of 1996, no Aliens comics. In those gap months, you've got the short story from A Decade of Dark Horse and the one-shot Lovesick. Lovesick is actually the return of Aliens product at the end of 1996. We begin to have semi-regular appearances in 1997. This is almost certainly related to the fact that the Aliens Resurrection movie sequel is going to come out in 1997. And so there's probably a desire on Fox's part to have comic product to help to support that upcoming sequel, especially after Alien 3 took a bit of a bath. But also, I think there's just a shift in priorities. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to go through the Dark Horse insider material, because it's clear Dark Horse has gotten into the movie business. They want to make their own movies. They don't want to just promote Fox's properties. So they're maintaining those licenses, but a lot of Max stuff, a lot of Dark Horse Heroes, a lot of stuff like Virus, Dr. Giggles, trying to take the resources that they used to allocate toward monthly Aliens product and putting that through their own company-owned materials. I think it's just a shift in priorities. They've maintained the license. I do think that they could have kept Alien stuff coming out as a trial, a field team, farm team kind of thing. It could have been one of those things that take the place of Dark Horse Comics or at Marvel Comics Presents, where you let new guys who are unseasoned do an Alien story. Maybe there was an issue with quality control with regards to Fox. Maybe they got some kind of a break on the license by not putting out a lot of content while holding the license. It's just weird to me because that's something you really do not see anymore. Dark Horse clearly had a very special relationship with Fox that they were able to go for long periods of time without doing anything with those properties. Today, you would not hold a license and not be putting out product. They would pull the license. It's just a weird situation to have such spotty representation of aliens in comics during this time period. Although, again, we're going to have crossovers. We'll be dealing with that in the near future. While working on the podcast, the intention was started off as a solo show. This was the first hybrid show I've done where I go between being on my own to being with guests. All that early Aliens material had people who wanted to talk about it lined up. I knew I had my boys from the Rolled Spine crew available to me when I needed them. We're kind of on the fumes of the first hurrah of Aliens. This is the golden age of Aliens comics ending. We've had all that material that was put out in the 90s, the early part of the 90s. This is entering a fallow period. The idea was, since I'm getting toward the end and not a lot of people are concerned about covering this material, well, how about I get Mr. Fix-It to come in and finally do his episode, and then I'll have both Mr. Fix-It and Illegal Machine team up for the martial law episode, and then there'll be a nice transition. We'll have the passing of the baton, and then Illegal Machine will do the last of the Aliens miniseries before this hiatus. Unfortunately, work demands prevented that from happening. I'm not really broken up about it because it's not that great of a miniseries. Since this would have been Mac's opportunity to talk about his history with aliens, we would probably talk more about that and not so much about the actual story. Not that there's much to it. It didn't work out that way. Hopefully he'll get to read a better story and something we can talk about at greater length. Instead, plays into the feeling of an ending, that Aliens as we knew it is sort of wrapping up, and everything that's going to come from this point onward is sort of either a revival or has some kind of gimmick to it. Aliens is not sustaining itself on its own merits anymore, and it's going to need other people to kind of help it. The good news for that is that it's a lot easier to book guests when you've got Aliens and something to get their attention. Also, the fact that there isn't this constant churn of creative teams, there isn't hopefully going to be so much overlap of story materials, plot elements. They can take a little bit more time to cook it, and so it'll be a little bit tastier when they do put out a new project. But definitely the first major phase of Aliens podcasting is over with, and we're going to have some weirder stuff coming forward because it's not a matter of covering miniseries after miniseries. Now it's going to be specials. Now we're going to be grouping together all those little short stories and doing alien omnibuses. And to be honest with you, I got a project that I've been working on little by little throughout the year that I want to do in 94, and I'm not sure how that's going to impact on Aliens. It's been great to have monthly Aliens podcasts coming out. It's the only podcast we do where I've gotten one out every month since its inception. So I hate to break up that streak, but the material that I'm looking at covering with this other podcast would be somewhat of an overlap again. And so it's almost like, well, do I want to maybe do this other show and then an Aliens and kind of alternate months? Do I want to take a year off from Aliens the way the Dark Horse did and do this other thing and then come back to Aliens? You guys might be a little aliensed out. I think partly it's the material, but I'm not getting as much interaction with listeners on this material as I did in the earlier days. I don't think there's as much engagement with this one. So maybe the show itself starting to wind down a little bit. I'm not ready to end it though, because I want to go through all those crossovers. I think that that's going to be fun and it's going to help to reinvigorate the show. And again, I wouldn't be doing anything any earlier than say October of this year. And probably I'm looking more at waiting until 94 before I even consider making any changes. If you guys have any comments or any suggestions, feel free to come up with those. It would probably help if I told you what the podcast can be about. I'm not ready to do that yet.
Between the Pages blog, Billet Spy Vinyl, Billy Hines, who added catnip, CH, Capital Gain Income, Chris Dunford, Chris Lydon, Chunky Apps, Colonel Guano, David Galayer, Dear Watchers, and Omniversal Comic Book Podcast, Del Dracula, who wrote, been waiting so long for martial law content from you guys. Sneaking this story into the Alien show was a great surprise. Dim Kunke, Dirk Action is finally finishing Kraken Rider of Sea. Ed Moore, History of Comics on Film. Iowa's Joe Is. Jeff Times 11 asked, I wonder if it was originally meant to be an Aliens crossover. Martial Law Takes Manhattan was meant to be a Punisher crossover, but Marvel chickened out. There was meant to be a Batman crossover, but DC showed the same amount of courage. Jolt and Johnny Lucas wrote, what? Didn't know about this martial law? Need to hunt them down. Julia Raoul Rainbow Edition. Keith G. Baker, Lamar the Revenger, Marvel and DC, Mike It Send Aliens to Me, Movie Mats Royce, Once Upon a Geek, Pavel L, Rap Rabbit at Fresh Prince of Corain, Rihanna Mike, Richard Field, Siskoid, Superbound, Talk Nerdy to Me.
This has been a Rolled Spine podcast. All audio samples are believed covered under fair use laws. No copyright infringement is intended.
Coming in August, Dark Horse presents The Predator Versus with guest Fryhole.